Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodes Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you a story today written in 1839 called Jim Sullivan's Adventures in the Great Snow by the Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. Sheridan Le Fanu walked the earth in Ireland from 1814 to 1873. Today's story was among Le Fanu's early short stories that were published in a collection called the Purcell Papers in 1880 after his death. The fictional premise of the Purcell Papers was that all of the stories were told to the late Catholic priest Father Purcell and were left to Le Fanu in his will. Since the following story was written in heavy Irish dialect, I have adapted the original language to make it easier on contemporary ears. I apologize in advance for my ham-fisted attempt at an Irish accent. Hear the words of old. Jim Sullivan's Adventures in the Great Snow by Sheridan Le Fanu, written in 1839. The following story is the 9th extract from the papers from the late Father Francis Purcell of Drumculog. Jim Sullivan was a decent, honest boy as you'd find in the 7 parishes, and he was a beautiful singer, and an elegant dancer entirely, and a mighty pleasant boy in himself. But he had the devil's bad luck, for he married for love, and of course he never had an easy minute after. Nell Gorman was the girl he fancied, and a beautiful slip of a girl she was, just 20 to the minute when he married her. She was as round and as complete in all her shapes as a firkin barrel, you'd think, and her 2 cheeks was as fat and as red it would open your heart to look at them. But beauty is not the thing all through, and as beautiful as she was, she had the devil's tongue, and the devil's temper, and the devil's behavior all out, and it was impossible for him to be in the house with her, for while you could count to 10 without having an argument, a moment later she'd rise an argument with him, and she'd hit him with the skillet or whatever lay next to her hand. Well, this wasn't at all pleasing to Jim Sullivan, ye may be sure, and there was a scarce a week that his head wasn't plastered up, or his back bent double, or his nose swelled as big as a potato, with the violence of her temper. And his heart was scalded everlastingly with her tongue, so he had no pace or quietness, in body or soul at all, with the way she was going on. Well, your honour, one cold snowing evening he came in after his day's work a-regulating the men on the farm, and he sat down very quiet by the fire, for he had a scrimmage or argument with her in the morning, and all he wanted was warmth of the fire. So divil a word he said, but drew a stool and sat down close to the fire. Well, as soon as the woman saw him, says she, "Move off," says she, "and don't be intruding on the fire." Well, Jim kept never minding, and didn't let on to hear a word she was saying. So she came over, and she had a spoon in her hand, and she took just the smallest taste in life of the boiling water out of the pot, and she poured it down on his shins, and with that he let a roar you'd think the roof would fly off of the house. "Hold your tongue, you barbarian," says she, "you'll waken the child." "And if I done right," says he, for the spoonful of boiling water burned him entirely, "I'd take you and I'd stuff you into the pot on the fire, and boil you in castor oil." "That's purty behavior," says she. "It's fine usage you're giving me, isn't it?" says she, getting wickeder every minute. "But before I'm boiled, try how you like that," says she. And, sure enough, before he had time to put up his guard, she hot him a real terrible clink of the iron spoon across the jaw. "Hold me back, some of you, or I'll murder her," says he to the world. "Will you?" says she, and with that she hit him another 10 times as good as the first. "By jabbers," says Jim, slapping himself behind, "that's the last salute you'll ever give me, so take my last blessing, you ungovernable beast," says he, and with that he pulled on his hat and walked out of the door. Well, Nell never minded a word he said, for he used to say the same thing every time she drew blood, and she had no expectation at all but he'd come back by time supper would be ready. But the story didn't go quite so simple this time. For while Jim was walking, lonesome enough, down the road, with his heart almost broke with the pain, for his shins and his jaw was mighty troublesome, of course, with the treatment he got, who did he see but Mick Hanlon, his uncle's servant, riding down quiet and easy on the old black horse with a halter as long as himself. "Is that you, Mr. Sulivan?" says Mick, as soon as he saw him a good bit off. "To be sure it is, ye spalpeen you," says Jim, roaring out. "What do you want with me this time o' day?" "Don't you know me?" says he. "It's Mick Hanlon." "Ah, blur and augers then. It's welcome you are, Mickey," says Jim. "How is all with me uncle?" "Oh," says Mickey, "bad enough. The old man's just off, and if you don't hurry like shot, he'll be in glory before you get there and die." "It's joking ye are," says Jim, sorrowful enough, for he was mighty partial to his uncle entirely. "Oh, not in the smallest taste," says Mickey. "The breath was just out of him when I left the farm, and, says your uncle, take the old black horse, for he's sure-footed for the road, and bring Jim Sulivan here, for I think I'd die easy if I could see him once more." "Well," says Jim, "will I have time to go back to the house, for it would be a consolation to tell the bad news to me wife." "It's too late you are already," says Mickey, "so climb up behind me for God's sake, and don't waste time." And with that he brought the horse up beside the ditch, and Jim Sulivan mounted up behind Mickey, and they rode off. And 10 good miles it was down the road, and it started snowing so fast that the old beast could hardly go on at all, and the 2 boys on his back was just like a snowball all as one, and almost frozen and smothered all at the same time, your honour, and they were both mighty sorrowful entirely, and their toes almost dropping off with the cold. And when Jim got to the farm, his uncle was getting on elegantly, and he was sitting up strong and warm in the bed, and improving every minute, and no signs of dying on him at all. So he had all his trouble for nothing. But this wasn't all, for the snow came so thick that it was impossible to get along the roads at all. And instead of getting better, next morning it was only 10 times worse. So Jim had just to take it easy and stay with his uncle until such times as the snow would melt. Well, your honour, the evening Jim Sulivan went away, when the dark was closing in, Nell Gorman, his wife, began to get mighty uneasy in herself when she didn't see him coming back at all. And she was getting more and more frightful in herself every minute, till the dark came, and a divil a taste of her husband was coming at all. "Oh," says Nell, "there's no use in pretending. I know he's killed himself. He has committed infanticide on himself like the dissipated blackguard as he always was. God rest his soul." "Ah, then, isn't it me and not you, Jim Sulivan, that's the unfortunate woman? But ain't I crying here, and isn't he in heaven, the blackguard?" says she. "Oh, it's not at home comfortable with your wife and family that you are, Jim Sulivan," says she, "but in the other world, in the glory with the saints, I hope. It's I that's the unfortunate female, and not yourself, Jim Sulivan," says she. And this way she kept on till morning, crying and lamenting. And With the first light, she called up all the servant boys, and she told them to go out and search every inch of ground to find the corpse. For I'm sure, says she, it's not to go hide himself he would. Well, they went out as well as they could, rummaging through the snow, until, at last, what should they come to, sure enough, but the corpse of a poor travelling man, that fell over the quarry the night before by reason of the snow and some liquor he had, maybe. But, at any rate, he was as dead as a heron, and his face was knocked all to pieces, just like an overboiled potato, glory be to God. And divil a taste of a nose or a chin, or a hill or a hollow from one end of his face to the other, but all as flat as a pancake. And he was about Jim Sulivan's size, and dressed out exactly the same, with a riding coat and new corduroys. So they carried him home, and they were all as sure as daylight it was Jim Sulivan himself, and they were wondering why he'd go and do such a dirty turn as to go kill himself for spite. Well, your honour, they gave him a wake as well as they could, with what neighbours they could get together, but by reason of the snow there wasn't enough gathered to make much diversion. However, it was a pleasant wake enough, and the churchyard and the priest being convenient, they buried it without a great deal of trouble. And about 3 days after the burying, old Jim Maloney, from the other side of the little hill, her own cousin by the mother's side, he had a snug bit of a farm, and a house close by the same token, came walking in to see how she was in her health, and he drew a chair, and he sat down and began to converse to her about one thing and another, until he got her quite uneasy and a middling good humour, and as soon as he seen it was time, says he, "I'm wondering, Nell Gorman, such a handsome girl as you is likely thinking of nothing but lamenting and the likes from your loss, and lingering away her days without any consolation or getting a husband," says he. "Oh," says she, "isn't it only 3 days since I buried the poor man?" says she, "and isn't it rather soon to be talking of marrying again?" "Divil a taste," says Jim Maloney. 3 days is just the time to a minute for crying after a husband, and there's no occasion in life to be keeping it up. And besides all that, Shrovetide, or the pre-Lenten season, is almost over, and if you don't be stirring yourself and looking about you, you'll be late, for this year at any rate, and that's 12 months lost. And who's to look after the farm all that time, and to keep the men to their work?" says he. "It's true for you, Jim Maloney," says Nell, "but I'm afraid the neighbours will be all talking about it." "Divil's a cure to the word," says he. "And who would you advise to be me new husband?" says she. "Young Andy Curtis is the boy," says Jim Maloney. "He's a likely boy in himself," says Nell. "And as handy a gossoon or servant too," says he. "Well then, Jim Maloney," says Nell, "here's my hand, and you may be talking to Andy Curtis, and if he's willing, I'm agreeable. Is that enough?" So with that, Jim Maloney made off with himself straight to Andy Curtis, and before 3 days more was past, the wedding came, and Nell Gorman and Andy Curtis was married as complete as possible. And if the wake was pleasant, the wedding was 10 times as agreeable, and all the neighbours that could make their way to it was there. And there was 3 fiddlers and lots of pipers, and old Connor Seamus the piper himself was in it. By the same token, it was the last wedding he ever played music at, for the next morning, when he was going home, being mighty hearty and pleasant in himself, he was smothered in the snow under the old castle. And by my soul he was a sore loss to the boys and girls 20 miles round, for he was the elegantest piper, barring the liquor alone, that ever worked a bellows. Well, a week passed over smart enough, and Nell and her new husband Andy Curtis was mighty well contented with one another, for it was too soon for her to begin to regulate him the way she used to do with poor Jim Sulivan. So they were comfortable enough. But this was too good to last, for the thaw came, and you may be sure Jim Sulivan didn't lose a minute's time as soon as the heavy drift of snow was melted enough between him and home to let him pass, for he didn't hear a word of the news from home since he left it, by reason that no one, good or bad, could travel at all with the way the snow was drifted. So one night, when Nell Gorman and her new husband Andy Curtis was snug and warm in the bed, and fast asleep, and everything quiet, who should come to the door, sure enough, but Jim Sulivan himself. And he began knocking on the door with a big blackthorn stick he had, and roaring out like the devil to open the door. "What the devil's the matter?" says Andy Curtis, weakening out of his sleep. "Who's knocking on the door?" says Nell. "What's all the noise for?" "Who is it?" says Andy. "It's me," says Jim. "And who are you?" says Andy. "What's your name?" "Jim Sulivan," says he. "By jabbers, you lie," says Andy. "Wait till I get at you," says Jim, hitting the door a lick with a wattle you'd hear a half a mile off. "It's him, sure enough," says Nell. "I know his speech. It's his wandering soul that can't get rest." "Let me in," says Jim, "or I'll drive the door in on top of yez." "Jim Sulivan," says Nell, sitting up in the bed and groping for a quart bottle of holy water she used to hang by the back of the bed. "Don't come in, darling. There's holy water here," says she. "But tell me from where you are, is there anything that's troubling your poor sinful soul? And tell me, Jim, how many masses will make you aisy? And by this cross, I'll buy you as many as you want," says she. "I don't know what the devil you mean," says Jim. "Go back," says Nell. "Go back to glory, for God's sake," says she. "Divil's cure to the bit of me will go back to glory, or anywhere else this blessed night," says Jim. "So open the door at once and let me in." "The Lord forbid," says Nell. "By jabbers, you'd better," says Jim, "or it'll be the worse for you," says he. And with that, he fell to walloping the door till he was fairly tired, and Andy and his wife crossing themselves and saying their prayers for the bare life of all time. "Jim Sulivan," says Nell, as soon as she was done, "go back, for God's sake, and don't be scaring me and your poor fatherless children," says she. "Why, you bosthoon, you," says Jim. "Won't you let your husband in, to his own house?" "You were me husband, sure enough," says Nell. "But it's well you know, Jim Sulivan, you're not my husband now." "You're as drunk as can be conceived," said Jim. "Go back, in God's name, peaceably to your grave," says Nell. "By my soul, it's to my grave you'll send me, sure enough," says Jim, "you hard-hearted bane. But I'm just off with the cold," says he. "Jim Sulivan," says she, "it's in your decent coffin you should be, you unfortunate spirit. What is it that's annoying your soul in the wide world? Hadn't you everything complete? The oil and the wake and the burying?" "It's too long I'm making a fool of myself," says Jim, "arguing with you outside of me own door. But it's plain to be seen you don't know what you're saying, and no one else knows what you mean, you unfortunate fool. So once and for all, open the door quietly, or, by my soakins, I'll not lave a splinter together." Well, when Nell and Andy seen Jim was getting vexed, they began to bawl out their prayers, with the fright as if the life was laving them, and the more he bait the door, the louder they prayed, until at last Jim was fairly tired out. "Bad luck to you," says Jim, "for a real divil of a woman. I can't get any advantage of you anyway, but wait till I get hold of you, that's all." And Jim turned off from the door, and went round to the cow-house, and settled himself as well as he could in the straw. And he was tired enough with the travelling he had in the daytime, and a good deal bothered with what liquor he had taken, so he was pretty sure of sleeping wherever he threw himself. But, by my soul, it wasn't the same way with the man and the woman in the house. For divil a wink of sleep, good or bad, could they get at all, with the fright of the spirit, as they supposed. And with the first light they sent a little gossoon servant boy, as fast as he could wag, straight off, like a shot, to the priest, and to desire him for the love of God to come to them on the minute, and to bring, if it was pleasing to his reverence, all the little things he had for saying mass, and saving souls, and banishing spirits, and freaking the devil, and the likes of that. And it wasn't long till his reverence came down, sure enough, on the old grey mare, with the little mass boy behind him, and the prayer books, and Bibles, and all the other mysterious articles that was wanting, along with them. And soon as he came in, "God save all here," says he. "God save ye kindly, your reverence," says Nell and Andy. "And what's gone wrong with ye?" says the priest. "Ye must be very bad off, entirely, to disturb me devotions this way, just at breakfast time." "Ah, by my soakins," an archaic term for soul, says Nell. "It's bad off enough we are, your reverence, for it's poor Jim's spirit. God rest his soul, wherever it is that was wandering up and down opposite the door all night in a way it was no use at all, trying to get a wink of sleep," says she. "It's to lay the spirit you want me to do, I suppose," says the priest. "If your reverence would do that same, it'd be pleasing to us," says Andy. "It'll be rather expensive," says the priest. "We'll not differ about the price, your reverence," says Andy. "Did the spirit stop long?" says the priest. "Most part of the night," says Nell. "The Lord be merciful to us all." "Ah, that'll make it more costly than I thought," said the priest. "And did it make much noise?" says he. "By my soul, that it did," said Andy. "Knocking the door with sticks and stones until I fairly thought every minute the old boards 'd smash, and the spirit 'd be on top of us, God bless us." "Phew," says the priest. "It'll cost a power of money then." "Well, your reverence," says Andy, "take whatever you like, only make sure it won't annoy us any more." "Oh, by my soakins," says the priest, "it'll be the strangest ghost in the 7 parishes if it has the courage to come back after what I'll do this morning, plaise God. So we'll say £12, and God knows it's cheap enough, considering all the circumstances," says he. Well, there wasn't a second word to the bargain. So they paid him the money down, and he sat the table down like an altar, before the door, and he settled it out with all the things he had with him. And he lit a bit of a holy candle, and he scattered his holy water right and left, and he took up a big book, and he went on reading for half an hour good. And when he came to the end, he took hold of his little bell and began to ring it for the bare life. And, by my soul, he rung the bell so well that he wakened Jim Sulivan in the cow-house, where he was sleeping, and up he jumped, without a minute's delay, and made right for the house, where all the family, and the priest, and the little mass boy was assembled, laying the ghost. And as soon as his reverence seen him coming in at the door, with a fair fright, the priest flung the bell at Jim's head, and hit him such a lick of it in the forehead that he stretched him on the floor. But the priest didn't wait to ask questions, but he cut round the table as if the devil himself was after him, and ran out the door, and didn't stop even as much as to mount on his mare, but ran away down the road as fast as his legs could carry him, though the mud was up to his knees, saving your presence. Well, by the time Jim came to himself, the family perceived the mistake, and Andy went home, leaving Nell to make the explanation. And as soon as Jim heard it all, he said he was quite content to leave her to Andy entirely. But the priest would not hear of it, and he just made him marry his wife over again, and a merry wedding it was, and a fine collection for his reverence. And Andy was there along with the rest, and the priest put a small penance upon him for being in too great a hurry to marry a widdy. And bad luck to the word the priest would allow anyone to say on the business ever after, at all. So of course no one offended his reverence by spaking of the 12 pounds he got for laying the spirit. And the neighbours were all mighty well placed, to be sure, for getting all the diversion of a wake and 2 weddings for nothing. And that concludes Sheridan Le Fanu's story called Jim Sullivan's Adventures in the Great Snow, written in 1839. This is John T. Rhapsodes, Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.